vein, we have a special treat for you today. Amber Jamilla Musser. There's a doctor in front of Amber as well, but I'll ask her when we start if I can call her Amber. She is an assistant professor of American Studies here at GW. Rather than introduce Amber, Dr. Musser, what I will do is I will let her introduce herself, as I think the conversation today will be focused a lot on identity, who gets to decide identity, who benefits from identity, and really defining yourself. Without further ado, we'll begin. Dr. Musser, can I call you Amber?
Definitely.
Why don't we start this conversation here? We're here to talk about a specific paper that you did called Specimen Days. But before that, why don't you just introduce us to yourself? Tell us a little about yourself, your work, your research agenda. What do we need to know about what makes Amber Amber?
Well, I mean, it's a big question. So I am currently a professor of American Studies I know I got promoted over the summer.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. It is very exciting. I live in New York. I am the author of two books. The first is called Sensational Flesh, Race, Power, and Masochism. And that was published in 2014 by NYU Press. And the second one is called Sensual Excess, Queer Femininity and Brown Jouissance, which was published in 2018 by NYU Press also. And a lot of my work sort of moves between theorization, how we sort of think about race and how we think about sexuality and gender. And also I've been working a lot more with aesthetics. So I also write art reviews and, sort of things like that. But I think one of my, I guess like the reason that you have me here today is that one of my big preoccupations is really, how race is talked about in sort of like the public sphere, how it informs how we know and what we know about the world, and how we interact with each other sort of like through these racialized lenses.
Good. So I greatly enjoyed Specimen Days. I was telling someone the other day, the way I got to your work was almost by accident. I was reading something else, which led to something else, which led to your name, which I Googled and was very excited to see you here at GW. And then we had a quick conversation, and this program kind of formulated. Because this is an education school, and we don't necessarily vary on the philosophical and the theoretical as much as maybe you all do in Columbia, I wanted to start with the method. Here at gshed, just to be quite frank and honest, we tend to be dominated by a positivistic type of thinking. Why don't you talk a little bit about critical oral biography, the method for this paper, why you think it's a rigorous method, and why you chose that method to reflect the type of knowledge you were trying to reflect in this paper?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, so I've never been trained as a social scientist. My background, my PhD is actually in history of science. So I do have more empirical training than you might expect. But I think one of the reasons that I was drawn to critical autobiography for this particular paper, I don't really use it in most of my other work, I would say. Most of that is more other critical forms of analyses. But one of the things about racialization is that the way that its impacts are produced often is on the level of emotions, and sort of people are really feeling how structures and sort of oppressions or possibilities, it's how they are felt. That's an important part of the way that race works and structures the way that we move through the world. And so, I mean, there's definitely a lot of research and information about quantifiable things in terms of how many people are doing X, Y, and Z. But I really wanted to get at the more subtle aspects and sort of, this, what does it actually mean to be in this kind of position? And the only way that I could figure out how to do that was to really take myself as the subject, because I obviously had more access to my own feelings about these different structures than I did about other people's. And I think especially something as complicated and as fraught as race, it would be complicated to try to interview people and expect to get a solidly self-reflexive set of answers. So critical autobiography was kind of a way to try to, I mean, I'm sure that people could read the essay and be like, well, maybe there's a little bit of performativity here, or you could, maybe you're holding back on some sort of aspects here. But it was really the way that I could imagine trying to tie together all of the different structures of racialization that I saw at work and make them cohere into one kind of entity, right, which was myself. It was otherwise really also hard to bring together kind of the discursive, the history of the university, the like small things that happen within departments and like scholarship, right? Because those are such different kinds of lenses. But race is really working on all of them, right? And that's the way it always works, that all of these different levels are happening all at once. And so to be able to like really synthesize that and make clear the importance. So I mean, you could also argue that it's also an argument for the importance of thinking about sensation and affect as methodological in their own right. So there are a few different reasons for critical autobiography.
No, good. Is critical autobiography or other type of methodologies, such as critical autobiography, particularly salient, particularly important for scholars of color, particularly those like you and myself? We're publicly saying this. I'm not giving out any private information, that have multiple oppressed identities. Would you say?
I think it can be a useful methodology for everybody. But I think one of the things that it especially allows people who occupy marginalized identities, especially multiply marginalized identities, is to speak at the nuances between, where these identities intersect and don't intersect. Because I find often, especially when you get into multiple forms of marginalization, there's sort of conflicting impulses that become really hard to tease out on a purely, say, discursive level, where you could just say, like, there's a contradiction, but in order to sort of really articulate, like, what does that actually mean, critical autobiography can help give purchase to that, right? And like help make clear what the stakes are, right? In this way that I think trying to sort of bring those things together on like a more structural approach would miss a lot of the nuance. And I think also there's, one of the issues in general with occupying a marginalized space is that one's voice is often silenced, right? Like people don't expect to hear from marginalized individuals. So there is also a power in sort of being like, this is, I am putting myself in the room and my knowledge is as important as everybody else's, right? Like it's not the same as Marx, right? But it's like it has a value that we need to take seriously in the same way that we take like critiques of capitalism seriously or all of these other types of things, right? Like that it's not, it should not be discounted just because it's coming from the realm of the personal.
So you mentioned at the tail end of your answer a critique of capitalism, and in reading your paper, one of the most striking things that I took from it was your description of these two opposing languages, one of liberation and one of corporation. And I would like you to speak just a little about that. First, what were you trying to say by creating that dichotomy? And in your opinion, since this paper was a few years ago, after describing what you were trying to say by that dichotomy, has the divergence between those two languages in the university, one of liberation and one of corporation, gotten wider over the last couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, so when I wrote this essay, I have a lot to say about sort of like what now. But when I wrote this essay, it was my first year as an assistant professor. So I was sort of just newly into what is the university, because it is a very different place when it is your place of employment versus when you are a student. I guess those would be sort of, or like when you're more tangentially employed there, right? Like when it was, when I had the possibility of being at that place forever, suddenly it became this like larger sort of situation for me. And one of the things I noticed was just, how this, and this is true, I think it's increasingly true since the moment that I wrote it, but the universities have really been dominated by corporate culture. And some of that is, we see in terms of like this consumer model, right? Where like, we need to make sure the students are getting everything that they need and sort of, like less emphasis on faculty governance is like one aspect. What I was focused on more, and I think this was because it was my first job, I was just really acutely aware of um, the way the universities, as part of this diversity, as part of this corporate entity, like corporations also like to be like, we are doing good, right? Like we are places where people with lots of different identities like to work. We espouse, we respect difference, we uphold it. But at the same time, when there are not actually that many people of color, right, or women, or LGBTQ people working at the university, right, suddenly there becomes like, if you represent any one, or in my case, like all three of those identities, then you are tossed front and center all the time. So the first thing I noticed was just like this intense crunch on my time, where I was being asked to do so many different things in a way that, say, other colleagues of mine who had just started at the same university did not, right? And I was just sort of like, what is this? And so I became really interested in sort of teasing out, like, how do I feel about this? On the one hand, I was aware that that made me very desirable, right? But in this kind of corporatized way, because I was desirable as a commodity, because then they could put me out there and say, like, look, we do all these things, but you're not just like on a brochure. It is also like my time and labor. And that's time and labor that I don't have for things like rest, for things like building a social life, for things like doing my own intellectual work, which are the things that actually the university, the tenure and promotion committees reward, right? So there was a sort of break between that. And so that was sort of one aspect. But the liberation part was in response to, that was kind of a moment, I think it was before gay marriage was legalized. But that was sort of a moment when there was also a lot of neoliberal pressure on identity categories as well. And sort of like this drive toward federal or whatever forms of recognition as their own form of liberation. So the tension that I'm talking about is sort of like the freedom I felt in being able to inhabit these identities and being able to sort of like proudly proclaim myself as a queer Black woman, but then also knowing that, my desire to make myself visible in these ways was coming at odds with sort of like the university's desire to like hold me up for that, but not necessarily give me meaningful support for that work, but to sort of bolster their own reputation in relation to me. So I would say, those tensions, I think the world is in I would say a worse place than it was in when I wrote that, 2015, 2014. So I would definitely say that those pressures are still there. I mean, I might say that the pressure, especially on faculty or people of color who are working in the university, has probably increased because of the heightened racial tensions, and so the effective labor that's happening around that, I think, is a lot greater than it was in that particular moment. But I think and we're now, because of the pandemic, we're in an even more a greater tightening of the university's desire to spend resources on it, and instead asking people to do that labor for the university's benefit, but without necessarily meaningful fiscal support or other forms of support. So I think we're worse.
Oh, well, truth could be truth, and you are the one being asked the question, so I appreciate the opinion. You just alluded to a concept that speaks throughout your paper, which is the sort of concept of fetishization and commodification of the person, which goes all the way back to chattel slavery, but speaks to today, and this concept of visible difference. The university wants you to say that, well, here, we care about diversity, look what we have, versus actual difference, meaning that we're trying to change the systems and the structures. And that was and is an incredibly nuanced way of thinking. As a college who I think, under the leadership of our dean, is trying to move in the right direction, do you have any suggestions for ways that academic programs or colleges can sort of value scholars of color without fetishizing, commodifying them, as you put it, for their difference?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great and important question. I mean, I think there's sort of well, there are more prongs than that. I think one is really even just acknowledging, because I don't think that there's a way to fully do away with this pressure on people's time and labor. But I think if universities acknowledge that that is happening and try to produce structures of compensation that align with that, right? So giving people monetary or teaching credit or some sort of credit for that labor, I think would go a long way towards making people at least feel appreciated and acknowledged, and sort of valorize that that is value that they are adding to the university. It's not sort of like free work that other people can extract, but it is part of, it is part of the package. So I think that that's like one step, away from this kind of commodification, or exploitation, I should say. It's not away from commodification. I think a more sort of like more meaningful steps towards change have to do with curricular shifts, and really thinking about the way that instruction on racialization and race are included, right? So sort of one of the problems with this idea of commodification is that race is often relegated as kind of like the elective topic, right? And sexuality also, that there's sort of like, there's this main universal set of ideas and theories, and then all of these other things are helpful for students or people who happen to occupy those identities, but nobody else needs to think about them. And so I think sort of like reintegrating these ideas and these histories and these forms of knowledge into what we consider universal will do a lot towards untokenizing, right? But that's like a huge, huge thing.
It is, yeah.
But I think that is like incredibly important. And then I think the last thing that I'll mention is I think really especially supporting the students of color in meaningful ways. I think one of the things that I've realized more recently, now that I'm more advanced in my career, and sort of like less at the beginning stages, is just, and I think part of it is like I knew that it was happening when I was a student, but I didn't quite think about it as much as now I have time to reflect on it because I have my own students and thinking about what my own practices of mentorship are. And I'm just realizing how often students of color are just sort of like left to their own devices and expected to sort of be grateful for the opportunity, but not actually given tools, right? And given support and respect in the same way that, say, other students necessarily are. So I think like really paying attention to, to how, because it's sort of like once you have that in the pipeline, right? Like that means that you're going to have more active voices in the classroom discussions. That will mean like more active, different voices in the curriculum, right? Like it spreads itself upward. But I do think that that's also an important part of this. And I don't think that the work of mentoring should just be like, okay, you are a Black faculty person, you need to only mentor, that mentorship, that increased mentorship should happen, across the board.
So I'm going to ask you a question that's a follow-up on this question that just came to my mind, which was, why aren't those practices which you just outlined, which quite frankly, I would just say seem to me, maybe because of what I study, kind of obvious, not adopted? Is it a hesitance on the system not to give up power? Is it a hesitance on certain faculty members because they were trained in this universalist model not to give up their own self-worth by letting that be challenged? Just based on your opinion, what do you think it is?
I mean, well, and I think it happens in different places in different ways, right? So I would say like American Studies, my home department, is actually quite integrate. It's like the whole half of the point of the department is basically like we are studying interdisciplinary forms of knowledge. We're talking about all these marginalized histories and how they impact what we think of as America, right? But that said, American Studies within the university is itself marginalized. So I think that part of the issue is that we still have this fetishization around, and this actually goes back to your first question, around what constitutes discipline, right? like what constitutes rigor, what constitutes acceptable forms of knowledge. And so when we sort of focus on like, okay, well, like what do we have the archives for? What do we have this for? It makes it easy for other forms of knowledge, right, or other people's archives and histories, who, for many types of reasons, might not be as easily accessible, to fall out of the wayside. And then it becomes, well, we don't have this information, so we can't put it in. And therefore, it erases people all over again, right? Which is part of the reason why other forms of knowledge, like critical autobiographies, visual culture, like all of these other types of things are also important, but they often are given less value within the academy itself. So I think that that's one kind of reason. The other is, I guess is also related, is that once this type of knowledge is devalued, universities have less incentive to compensate people for it, right? If you think of somebody as, like, well, yeah, it's great that they're here, but like, whatever, they're just like talking about their lives. Who cares? Like, why would we give them extra money? They're not like winning Nobel Prizes. And so that system of value just sort of floods downward. And then it becomes just sort of, and then it sort of, becomes this idea of like ungratitude. Like, why would they ask for more money or more anything when like they should just be happy that they're here and that we're letting them do this, right? Even though it's actually an exchange of labor. It's not like, it is sort of out of the goodness of one's heart, but it is, it's not acknowledged as labor because it's not valued. Its product is not seen as necessarily having a legible value in the same kind of way.
Oh, great answer. I want to let our audience know we're about maybe 10 to 15 minutes away from Q&A. So please get your questions ready for Amber. Can I ask this question as another follow-up? I've got so many questions, we're not going to get to all of it, but I think this one is important. There is someone in our audience digitally today that is maybe queer, in addition maybe Black, in addition maybe a woman, maybe one of our students at gsehd, maybe one of your students at Columbia, who is wondering, with COVID, with everything else, having read this paper and knowing what is in store for them in the academy, is this for me? Should I join? Having read that you can be tokenized, reduced to a specimen, a scientific observation, is this really the job for me? Is this the world for me? And I assume, and the research backs up, this is one of the reasons that we have difficulty bringing scholars of color into the academy. To that person, the person who is Amber now, but 20 years beyond, back from where you are right now, what advice would you give them?
It's so hard. I don't know. I feel like the academy, deciding to pursue academia is such a personal decision. I don't know how to give kind of more blanket advice, right? Because it does.
Well, let me modify the question then. What made you stay?
Well, I really like my research, and I feel, I really like all parts of, well, I hate meetings. I do not like meetings, but I really like my job. But I think, well, it's hard because even as I felt very tokenized and all of these things, I've been incredibly fortunate in terms of the way that the career trajectory has worked out, right? So that I didn't have anxiety about getting tenure. And then now I'm full professor. So now I'm like, I can do really whatever I want at this point. And so I don't have a lot of that, so I don't have that kind of anxiety, and the payoff of being able to write what I would like, give talks wherever I'd like, or sort of, all of that, mentor students, indulge in my curiosity, right, which is what I like about the academy, is there for me. I think honestly why I stayed was that I didn't understand that I had other options. So it's not like the best answer, but it is the honest one. I went straight through undergraduate to first I got a master's degree and then started my PhD. So I didn't really have a huge exploration of like what kinds of things could I do with my life. I like these types of things. I could do them here, or I could also do them here. The advice that I often give, my own grad students and undergraduates who are considering pursuing a PhD is, especially now, the knowledge that you may not be able to pursue this as a career just because of the shrinking number of tenure track jobs. But a PhD is worth it if you feel like you have a book in you, like a thing that you want to explore for that, you know, amount of time and like with that kind of depth. But you know, that's a tricky endeavor to sort of know that you like something enough that you might be okay with like producing this thing and then walking, you know, possibly having to walk away or possibly having to choose between pursuing it and living somewhere that you really don't want to live. You know, there are lots of different kinds of trade-offs, but I think I really just like at that point I was like, I don't know what else I would do, so I'm in it. And then it just sort of like eventually kind of worked, you know, kept like started to work out. But it was rough. It was rough.
Mm, mm, mm. Well, you went to great schools. I think, was it Yale or Harvard or both? Or
Yeah. I went to Harvard for undergraduate, and then I got a master's at Oxford, and then went to Harvard for my PhD.
what kept you motivated? Because saying it was hard, I think, goes for a given. Elevating the conversation to hard at that level, you were dealing with things that only you were dealing with because of your identity, and then the hardness of it being Harvard. What motivated you to get through all that?
I mean, again, I was young, you know, so I was just like, um, I mean, I really was just sort of like, I am very curious about this question. Like, I really believed in my project, and I really believed that I had something important to say that wasn't being said already in the academy. And I, you know, at this point now, I look back and I'm like, I feel like I must have been slightly delusional because I was like, this is going to be me. Like, yep, you know, I believe in it. It will happen. And then it, you know, it eventually did. But like, but a lot of it really was just a slight denial from reality and like a pushing onward. But I think, especially because I had already I will say that like I think it was harder for me. Undergraduate at Harvard was harder for me than graduate
Mm,
in terms of sort of the you know feelings of like imposter syndrome and just sort of the like what it is to be in a predominantly white institution. I think partially because graduate school was you know you're dealing with a smaller cohort, more specialized forms of knowledge. So it just felt it was less anxiety provoking in certain ways until closer to the end when suddenly you're like, but how do I get a job? And like, what does this mean? But at first it just felt like affirmation being in a program and being able to be like, oh, like I could, you know, wow, I can just do this. Like I didn't even know, I don't come from a family of academics. So just the idea that like this was possible, that like you could just spend your time learning
mm,
in this way was just like, I mean, it still remains to me like really incredible, you know, that that's a thing you can do.
mm. Do you ever have feelings like that right now when you're like, this is really, excuse my French, shitty, whatever you're going through at the time, but I'm so grateful for this opportunity, I am going to suck it up and deal with it. And should we, as scholars of color, make that a habit?
Well, that's, I mean, I feel like now you're turning into like the counselor.
Yeah, we have serious conversations here at GShed, so.
um, I mean, I definitely suck up so much that I'm like, you know, I would say especially with COVID because I don't have children, so I'm responsible for myself, which gives me a lot more free time than it does. I know a lot of my colleagues, which means that I have felt I have felt like that I want to try to help out in ways that I can. So I've been doing a lot more service for the profession than I have before, which is fun, you know, but it's a lot of work. It's also really tiring and like a lot of uncompensated labor. And again, it's like to try to ease some pressure, hopefully from other people who like really are struggling a lot. And especially because of the things that I'm asked to do, it's like also helping directly um, other people who are underrepresented in various ways, like try to get their scholarship out there, right? So doing like a lot of peer review for lots of things. And yeah, so much. And,
I'm familiar.
yeah, and it's, I mean, it's hard. I don't know what to say. Like, I shouldn't, like I did this week say like, please don't, you can't send me any more. I've done like so many of these. Like, I can't be the only person who's like taking this kind of service hit. But it's always, it's I think in like the most just sense of the world, like, no, we should be able to say like, no, I won't, there's a limit to how much I can give. I think what often feels complicated is that as you sort of go up in rank and are asked to be doing these things, often the people that you are sort of working on behalf of, right? Like, the person whose manuscript you are reading, the person whose tenure file you're writing on, and I would love to see so many more people get tenure and become full. Like, my goal is not to keep the rank small. My goal is to expand it. And so I'm aware that that does mean certain labor for me, especially in situations like that, where I feel like, well, I feel uniquely able to comment on that person's scholarship in a way that will make its value clear. That I worry about other readers possibly doing, or doing justice, and so I don't want to have people get shut out that way. So it's a complicated balance between, obviously I could say no, but I'd rather have more colleagues like me than yeah.
Yeah. So you do the work, sort of that invisible labor that we talk about and we write about in the higher ed literature a lot. Meg, this will be the last question, unless our audience doesn't have questions, and I have more. But I have this question for you, Amber, and it comes from a quote in your paper. So this comes from page 5, if anyone's following along. And it's, quote, exclusivity means that certain bodies are more desirable because they make visible an impulse toward change, even as they do not necessarily produce any movement beyond this visibility. Their presence confers status because they are rare, desirable, and visible. And this is talking about that concept, so powerful from your paper, of visible difference. So my question is sort of twofold. One, is visible difference a prerequisite to actual change? Meaning that, when you are a faculty, a staff, or a program where what we're trying to do is simply increase the numbers, is that the right path? Because without that, there is no systemic change. And the second question, in your opinion, are there ways, times, reasons which scholars of color, our responsibility is to say no to being that visible difference if there is not a promise for systemic change? So you get that offer from Yale, Stanford, Harvard, or University of Memphis, it doesn't matter, and they really want you, and the package shows they really want you, but you get the sense that that's it. They just want you. They're not actually going to change anything. They're not going to make things comfortable. They just want you to say that they have you. Sort of that fetishization. So 2 questions. Is visible difference a prerequisite? And should we, as scholars of color, be more aware of not feeding into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the question of visible difference it's so complicated. I mean, I think I feel like the way that our society is oriented, it's sort of, we have imagined that it always has to be the prerequisite for substantial change. But I think that's because we're assuming a lot of conflation between who is in the room and what kinds of interests they will necessarily represent, right? But look, we have Clarence Thomas. I'm not entirely clear that visible difference in the room has shifted anything with regard to the way race is handled, say.
Yeah, it's made it worse. So it's my opinion. Dwayne Wright, not Dr. Musser.
So that's like a clear example, right? Where visible difference does not necessarily correlate with a shifted thing at all. But I think it's also, you can't have no visible difference and then expect things to change, right? It's possible that could happen, but generally that tends to mean some sort of conservation of an imagined, an imagined unity, right? It's sort of they have to flow from each other or in relation to each other. But I think the question is sort of which comes first?
Chicken and egg, yeah.
And the truth is, often people who feel most charged with leading initiatives around diversity, inclusion, and sort of revaluing difference are people who inhabit those identities, right? And so in those cases, change would follow from having more visibly different people in the room. But but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, right? So we could also imagine a situation in which ideas around revaluing difference and knowledge and marginalized histories, right? It's like more broadly incorporated. And then we could imagine that like many people who look all sorts of different kinds of ways are actually also invested in this project of difference. It's just because we've siloed it that we've created these compressions, right? But if it was not that way, then I'm sure that many people would have lots of different ideas about how to do that, right? And then that would not have to happen. In these sorts of situations. And I think like I feel like I have to just like say this, like one of the other outcomes of this kind of compression of identity and desire is like these white women who pretend to be scholars of color, right? It's sort of like this, right? Like this imagined that like difference must only, because imagine how powerful it would have been to be like, I am making an assertion for the value of this marginalized knowledge, and I don't have to inhabit that identity, right? There's no need for that conflation to happen, but it's a misreading of where value lies that allows that kind of form to happen. And it's sort of like mistaking this this idea of a visible difference for the place of value, right? When it's actually like more about the epistemological shift. So that's like all of that. I forgot the other.
So the second part is, should scholars of color, when approached, and let's say you usually don't have the information to do this. Let's say you got a sister, you got a brother, you got someone else on the inside that says, look, I know what they're telling you, but they ain't really going to do much. You'll get paid well, but if you're really looking to change the place, if that's what they're selling you, come here and help us change, they're not going to do that. Should we start turning down some of these offers that are clearly motivated only by visible difference, but either through their actions, their inactions, or through other information, you realize the institution doesn't really want to change?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, we know the institution will always find somebody to say yes. I mean, that's not true. There have been some positions that it's been interesting how long they've been open, and you can tell that somebody is spreading. Someone has inside information there. I mean, I think it's. I mean, in an ideal world, I would say, like, obviously, yes, people should say no and like stand up for their beliefs. I think the world that we actually operate in, though, it's so complicated. Depends on like the geographic location of those places, like what kinds of other options someone has. If somebody doesn't have, if that's the only job offer you have, I mean, you could say no to to make a point. The question then is, where does that leave you? Like, if you feel like you can still do what you think you want to do in life without that type of position, that's great, right? But if you feel like you still want to, teach, read, write, all of these types of, you do it in those kinds of ways. I think it's really especially if you're being compensated well. I think, people, it's one thing if you're saying no to an exploitative position where you're also not being paid very well, and just be like, I'm going to sit this out. But I think it is more complicated once, people have egos too. There are like all sorts of different things at play that I don't think we can negate. I want to imagine that people have enough awareness that if they are feeling conflicted about this and decide to say yes, they can have some kind of critical reflexivity and be like, okay, I've been given this opportunity. What are things that I can do in this position? Like maybe, like I know, I have a bunch of friends who teach at Yale, which, as not that well known for what they've done in terms of being able to retain faculty of color and sort of with it. But, a lot of them have been sort of like, okay, well, now I'm going to try to channel resources into like at least paying artists of color to like come give talks, or like, trying to funnel money in other kinds of ways, which is not the same thing as like deep institutional change. But it's not, I don't think it's like nothing, right? Like people are always trying to work with within their constraints.
No, I get that. So, Meg, I said we were moving on, but I lied. I've got one more question. And it's a question that is a follow-up. And I wasn't going to ask this, but since you mentioned it, I'll take the liberty. The Jessica Crunk situation, as someone who is Black and queer myself, but as someone who, if I wanted to, could pass for heterosexual, affected me in ways that I think I am now beginning to be able to talk about publicly. But I am not a woman. So, as someone who's Black, who's queer, who's a scholar, most importantly, and as someone who was in not just the same university, but the same school as the person that instigated that situation, one was, what was your initial reaction? And two, having had the time to let the emotions cool down, what lesson should we as a GW community take from that situation? And after this, I swear, Meg, we will go to
Yeah.
questions.
I mean, well, that was a crazy day. So I was actually like visiting friends that I hadn't seen for a long time. And then my phone started blowing up. And I was like, what is wrong with people? And at first, I mean, I was shocked. I was really, really shocked. And then the more, and I actually did not know her because I haven't been at GW very long. So I don't actually know that many people that are not within my specific department. Um, but one of the things that, so I was shocked, and then I felt very angry, and then I felt not exactly hurt, but kind of vulnerable. I think largely because of the way the particular forms of sexualized blackness and policing that were occurring around like her performance of what it is to be like a black woman, right? And just sort of, I think partially because, and I talk about this a little bit in Specimen Days, right? That there, I had my so much of my own negotiation because I didn't grow up in the U.S. I was born a U.S. citizen, but I was born in Ecuador and then moved internationally before high school and coming to the United States. And so a lot of my own negotiations around blackness were just sort of like around this crisis of authenticity and sort of, am I black enough? Like, I don't understand my relationship to this form, right? And it gave me a lot, and that was also part of the crisis around sort of being asked, like, always perform as a black woman. I was like, I have a complicated relationship with this idea of blackness, like as my mom's from the Caribbean, as like a Caribbean, like sort of US, but not really US. And then I'm being asked to sort of like represent Black women more generally. Like it was really, really, really hard for me. And like a lot of that frustration is where this piece comes from. And so to see this person just sort of like take on that identity just like that was really so painful because it makes you really see that one of the things that happens when you live through these identities, right, is that you acquire years of trauma, right? Like not necessarily in a bad way, but like you've actually lived through it. So, I mean, I'm sure that my educational background and her educational background are not necessarily different, but, I did have, say she started saying that she was Black when she only became operating in the world as a Black woman, say from the time she was 30 onward. I'd had at that point like 30 years on her of
Mhm.
existing. And so like, my crises of Black authenticity as a 4-year-old versus as like all of those things accrue and shift how you operate in space. And so I was really upset that she could just like take this on, this identity that I had so many years of trying to negotiate through. And then the way that she deployed it, right, in terms of telling other Black women, like, you're not Black enough. And
Mhm.
you're not, I found that an extra sort of layer of hurt and also just sort of a great misunderstanding about how racialization works, right? And sort of like how identity
Mhm.
functions in general. And then also just like, and then I had this moment of like, we should have known because of the way her emboldened taking up of space. I was like, no one who actually had grown up with that history would behave in those ways because it was so used to being policed and shut down and
Mhm.
marginalized, right? So I had like layers um, in that. And then, I mean, mainly I was just sort of like, I really want to, and I'm proposing a book with a friend of mine, a short book on white women and Black feminism, because I'm just like, how does this misunderstanding happen? Like, how do people imagine that you can just say that you're Black and that it would confer advantages, right? It's just
Mhm.
so there was just like, so, like, I just felt like there was like so much of my own struggle had just been like wiped away, in a way that felt like really violent. And also just like, just like these forms of misrecognition that, I was like, people really don't know what race is in this country, right? Or like how
Yeah.
we work through the world.
Well, yeah, well, I think the last 4 years have clearly, the last year, but then the last 4 years have clearly shown that. But I'll veer away from politics, and I'll say this: any lessons that we as a GW community should take from that. I know not hire better. I think we should be screening out hires better, and that's just not Jessica Crump. But any lessons as a community of scholars, as a community of maybe white scholars who seek to support scholars of color like you and I, what lesson should GW take away from the Jessica Crump situation?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it comes down to, I'm sure, though I don't know her, but it would I would imagine that part of her incentive for that is this fetishization around diversity, right? So I think, whatever steps are taken in general away from that kind of commodification of people of color will reduce the incentive to produce that kind of charade, right? So that's like one. And then the other, I really think, and it's hard like these days because everyone is so pushed for time and money and just like stressed. But I still think like actually there's just such an imagination that once one has become a professor that these struggles around race are over. And that like suddenly like the playing field is the same. So I think whatever forms of mentorship, space, just sort of like acknowledging that that is not actually true. Again, like I think acknowledging does a lot of work, right? Because it can start to train people to try to respond better and come up with different solutions. Like I don't necessarily have all the solutions, but I think if we start to, stop treating people of color as if like their only function is to represent diversity and not actually that they're not whole people with like their own lives and their own paths and their own all of these things, right? But it's sort of like if we can just treat people as holistic beings, I think that will be like renewing in lots of ways, right? And I think people will feel the difference. Because as much as like I think programs like targeted opportunity hires are good, it does feel suspect when it feels like that's the only way that people of color are being hired, right? Like if that's the only way that, because then that's really saying like this, you're being valued because like you are a diverse person, but that's not the same thing as saying like we value this form of knowledge, right? Or like the insights, and so just sort of like really taking a critical look at hiring practices across the board to really think about like what is going on. Like, are we always imagining like the way that we're going to get a person of color is through this kind of like backdoor thing because we're imagining that they wouldn't necessarily cut it in this other.
The soft bigotry of low expectations, one president said. That's not my support for George Bush, it's just a good quote. I have so much more questions for you, Amber, but I've already denied my audience 10 of their minutes, and I won't do that. We're going to convert now, and I want to open it up. You said a lot, and I want to hear questions, reactions for Dr. Musser, questions about the paper, questions about anything we said so far. This is a really general Q&A. Please state your name and your affiliation to university if you are affiliated, because we have two schools here. And yeah, we're ready. Use the chat. Anyone want to do the first question?
I have a question, Dwayne. I don't know if you can hear me.
Hey, Dr. Howard, go ahead.
First of all, thank you, Dr. Musser and Dr. Wright, for this interesting conversation. So many points you've raised just resonate in my own autobiography as a faculty member here. I'm a faculty member in the School of Education, and I do work with race and gender socialization. I'm a developmental psychologist, and so I see a lot of crossover in our work, and also one who does critical research and thinks about critical methodology. So I'm excited that you're here at GW, number one, and hope we can continue this conversation. So I have two things. I have one sort of reaction and then one question. One, at some point, I would love to hear us talk too about the other person who was formerly affiliated with GW, H.G. Carrillo, who also pretended to be something other than who he was, right? And as a Black man pretending to be Afro-Cuban or Cuban, and what that means, if we're giving it the same sort of reading as Jessica Krug, right? And sort of what that might mean for how we think about performance of identity. Separate from that comment, I'm curious to know your perspective on diversity statements. So we see now as our students are going into the job market, being asked to produce these diversity statements. And oftentimes for students who hold multiple, occupy multiple marginalized identities, their work is very much centered in that statement itself. So I'm curious to know what your thoughts are about the request for those statements and then how they get taken up potentially as evidence of action versus commodifying them.
Though that is a great question. I know the H.G. Carrillo thing, it's so hard. I mean, I don't have much to say about that, but I do agree with, or I will note that it is interesting. They have been treated so differently. Whereas I feel like, I think partially because Carrillo was teaching creative writing, there's sort of this emphasis on like, well, I guess he just was creative about everything. I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, I think some of that also has to do specifically around the different forms of disciplining around gender too, like the disciplining of Black women versus white women versus Black men, right? And sort of like what types of expectations are circulating there. I also wonder how much it has to do with the fact that we don't have that many, partially because Afro-Latinos are so underrepresented. There's less of a cultural imaginary, you know, so that like Carrillo is stepping into sort of a different kind of space within the popular imagination than Krug was. And so that's some of the different, my understanding also though, in terms of their performance is that Carrillo was sort of presenting it as like, this was my life, but not necessarily just using it as like, a disciplinary formation against others in the way that Krug was actually like telling people that they were not authentic enough. So that's also, but anyway, I mean, that's just whatever things. But diversity statements, man, I hate those things. They are the worst. I think especially because of what you're saying, right? Like it's hard to have them not feel as though, especially if that's what you work on, where you're just sort of like, this is essentially the same thing as my research statement. I don't fully understand why universities, I think there are two reasons why universities require them. I think sometimes it is kind of more in the corporate neoliberal sense of trying to be like, okay, we do care about this and we are performing that by asking you to fulfill this, but they don't actually necessarily like read them that much, but you have to have enough to say to produce one. And then I think that there are people who are reading them critically to think about like, okay, we actually want to understand that your understanding of, you know, what your understanding of diversity means. And I think that can get complicated because sometimes those statements, that means that people are looking for a willingness to take on all of this extra labor. And so they'll be like, okay, your understanding of diversity means that you know that you will also mentor students or that you will set up all these programs, right? And so it becomes this kind of litmus test for like how much work someone is willing to do. I want to imagine that there are frameworks where people are reading them to be like, oh, this person understands race as like an epistemological disruption, right? And so that when they're saying diversity, it's not just about their scholarship, but also like, what are the values that they bring in? Although I don't think it often ends up actually being that. I think that's like my fantasy of what a diversity statement could be. But it's hard for me to see them as separate from this kind of like even more aggressive outreach into the neoliberalization of the institution, right, and identity.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting request because I also wonder too, for folks whose work does not center these ideas, it becomes some ways a documented performance that never really becomes borne out in their actual practice, right? And so it becomes espoused, but not sort of practiced once they are brought into the institution. And so it feels like such a tenuous sort of tool to make a decision with such profound effects.
Well, and that's the thing. I don't think that it's hard for me to imagine that they actually are used. I think that they could be used to, if someone is on the, like, people aren't sure, it could be used against someone.
Yeah.
But it's hard for me to imagine that it would be used as like the primary criteria, you know, or something with, yeah. But I mean, I think some of it honestly is just, it's kind of like, can you recite the Pledge of Allegiance? It's like, do you know what diversity is enough so that even if your research has nothing to do with it, you can rehearse something about like your forms of representation and or your willingness to engage with others. And so I think you're totally right that it is like this interestingly performative exercise because it does not tied to like any consequence, right? Like they're not going to bring you on campus and be like, okay, so now we're going to give you this much money for diversity. And what would you do with it? You know?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Howard. That was an excellent question, and I will resist the temptation to put a follow-up, and I'll just ask for the second one. Does anyone else have another question? Faculty, students, staff, it doesn't matter. Any questions for Dr. Musser?
This is Christine Nganger from ELA. I have a question.
Go ahead, Christine.
Thank you, Dr. Musser, for your wonderful contribution to gsehd. My question is related to racial battle fatigue. Have you dealt with it, especially in your younger days as a scholar, and how did you sustain yourself? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think I would imagine it's impossible to not feel that. I don't know. I think it's always hard in these things because it's like, how did you deal with it might imply that I had good ways of dealing with it as opposed to I got very angry and I did feel very burnt out. And then I was fortunate to have a sabbatical in which I like tried my best to just completely disengage from my institution. So I guess that would be my answer for sort of how to cope with this. In my case, I really felt part of the issue was that I was feeling this kind of fatigue, but most of my points of intersection were with the institution. And so once I kind of reminded myself that I had a life beyond it, that I was like not entirely contained by the conditions of my employment, that I did have friends and family and like hobbies and things that I liked, that was like a me outside of this. That helped a lot and helped me rejuvenate. It did unfortunately take me a lot longer to reach that kind of point. But I think with this kind of work, because it's sort of like the commodification of like you as a person, it's hard to find the boundaries for where like doing it ends and like your own life begins. At some point it starts to feel like the pressure is to have everything be taken up by this, right? And I think, so I feel like ways to kind of separate that out become important. And for me, that's all about sort of remembering that like, this is my job, not my entire life. In terms of like other forms of racial battle fatigue, where, you know, especially in these 4 years as racial tensions have escalated, and it becomes a thing that's like not that it was ever entirely relegated to like, this is only happening in the academy. But I mean, it is really hard to be living in a world where it feels like everything you're doing is sort of in relation to some form of oppression, and sort of like all you want is like some space, at least occasionally, to not have to deal with that, right, or to recharge. But I think in that way, like the same advice, the same thing holds true for me. Like I know I've gotten a lot out of developing. Like I do a lot of yoga, I meditate. Just sort of, I found like spiritual practices and like ways to deal with the world that are divorced from labor, divorced from even representation in that kind of way, because those are areas that I feel like a lot of pressure have been very helpful.
Thank you. I find the passions that draw us to this work cause us to get deeper and deeper into it, but then it takes so much of our emotional energy.
It does. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just, yeah, I mean, this year especially has been very challenging. I think one of the things that, it's useful having all these like young people do stuff and teach us things. Like one of the, I don't even know who they are exactly, but I see a lot of posts on Instagram from the Ministry of Naps saying that it's like really important to remember to rest, that is also part of the politics. And I try to remember that too, right? That like it's not, engagement is good, but if you don't take time to deal with yourself and replenish yourself, then you can't, you won't have anything to give.
Thank you, Christine. Probably have time for one more question with Amber, if you will. Anyone has a final question before we wrap up? I will say this when we finish up, but this has been wonderful, Amber. Thank you for it. Thank you for your vulnerability. Thank you for your work as a scholar and for your work as I will say, a mentor, a role model for aspiring young queer scholars of color. We appreciate it. So thank you. But before we send her away back to enjoy New York, any last final questions? Anyone with a final question? If not, I'll take the final question, Amber, if you don't mind. What advice would you give to an aspiring queer scholar of color who is looking to get in the academy but does not want to be a specimen? So someone that's coming up and that won't be a professor anytime soon, and it's like, I'm dedicated to being part of this mission, part of this ivory tower, part of this production of knowledge, but I cannot do it, or I will not do it, or I'm choosing not to do it as a specimen. What steps, what advice, if any, would you have?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky because I think the problem with being a specimen is that it's not like a thing that one wants to do, right? It's like it's thrust upon you. So I think it would be impossible to completely avoid. But I think that there are ways to sort of like mitigate it. I think one is definitely having an appropriate relationship with your work and job, which is to say, I feel like I'm just saying the same thing to these last questions, which is like, have a life outside of your job, but just sort of remembering the wholeness of your person. I think I feel like that's the only way to really avoid these processes of commodification, right? Because I think once you step fully into that, and that can just mean like, okay, that means I'm only going to respond to email for a half hour every morning, right? And that's like already a ton of other time that you've given yourself that's like not about this, right? I mean, I don't know if that's totally realistic, but whatever. But like imagine remembering that because I think one of the ways that people also fall into this trap, right, is there's so much of academy that's about ego and so much about like, it's nice to write, but ideally you want other people to like read what you are writing, right? And like you want to be part of conversations and you want to engage. But I think remembering that you can have forms of engagement that aren't necessarily bound by the same types of rules is helpful. So like have these conversations with your friends, have friends that are not academics only, like sort of just widening these types of spheres, I think can help at least not have the worldview feel so narrow. It's tricky because someone who's up and coming doesn't have the same access to trying to produce transformational change within the institution, right? So some of this work is like, okay, there's like a limited amount of stuff that somebody can do without institutional power. Some of this work becomes a question of sort of like, what do I say as someone who, you know, is a full professor? Like, what can I do to shift these forms of balance that will make the questions for someone who's coming up, you know, give them different types of options, right? Because there's definitely always the power of refusal, but that doesn't necessarily shift, you know, that just means like somebody else is gonna, you've saved yourself, but like the whole problem is still there, right? Like you might not be on the diversity brochure and like you might not answer emails and like that would be great, but like the apparatus is still untouched. And that I think is really a question for people who have more institutional power to figure out, you know, how to really effectively lobby for more resources, lobby for, you know, ways to like shift curriculum, change how things are valued. So it's on people who are writing tenure letters, people who are performing evaluations, and things like that. Like that's where some of this type of change will happen. Yeah.
Any final questions? Did that provoke anyone's curiosity juices? Well, Dr. Musser, you do have a GW email, so if any of our faculty, students, or staff want to reach out to you to follow up, they can feel free to do so. On behalf of gsehd, the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Initiatives, our faculty, our students, our staff, and our Dean, Michael Ford, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us today. Thank you for being vulnerable. Thank you for sharing with us. And we hope to have this conversation continue. So if there's any way we can assist you in your research as you grow as a scholar, please do let us know, because we are invested not just in your work, but in you. Thank you again, and thank you to my audience. It's always good seeing people that come out and hearing people engage with your questions, and we will see you again soon. Right?